welcome to another edition of Laguna Woods Stories, in which we meet interesting people who live here in the woods. And we have a very interesting person today, and this is Kurt Abdush. And just looking briefly at his resume here, he is a professional naturalist and environmental educator. He has worked as administrator of the George Page Museum, otherwise known as the La Brea Tar Pits, right?
Yes, indeed.
So you worked there for a while, and you've been on the faculty and staff of both the University of California, UCLA, and USC, and a bunch of other stuff that we'll get into later. So, Kurt, where were you born? Where did you originally come from?
Yeah, I came from Nebraska, Omaha in particular.
Okay.
And I started my practice there after graduating, and after that moved culture shock-wise to Iowa, of all places.
Okay.
And, ran a nature center, started it and ran it for a few years, and then went to Washington, D.C., where I was on the staff of the National Wildlife Federation.
Really?
Mm-hmm. And from there, out to California.
Wow. And you've been living here in Laguna Woods for how long now?
Well, that's an interesting story. I started living here in 2002, and this is my third strike here. I've lived here 3 times.
You keep getting lured away to...
yeah, I moved out. I moved out of the state for a while and then came back. And, yeah, so I've been here.
Now, I see you have brought a number of artifacts, most of which the audience can't see right now, but you had a carload of stuff that you unloaded. So what's all this stuff about?
Well, this is about mammoths today, and I've written a book about mammoths called Big M, the Mammoth of Moorpark. We can kind of focus on that after we talk about mammoths in general. Mm-hmm. And I think most people are familiar when you talk about mammoths, you talk about big, and you're also talking most of the time about woolly mammoths.
Okay.
In California, we had no woolly mammoths. They were too far north and didn't live...
Too warm in California.
Too warm in California, yeah. But warm enough for 2 or 3 other kinds of mammoths that came here. And one in particular that we'll talk about later is a very unusual specimen or species.
So we have a model of a mammoth that
yes,
you...
this is a woolly.
Okay, and they roamed over much of the earth, including the Americas, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yeah, they were circumglobal, you could call it, and circumpolar as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, they were far north species. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And you mentioned that there is another variety of mammoths in Southern California.
Yes, there were at least 2 others. Mm-hmm. One was the Columbian mammoth. The most common one was the Columbian mammoth, and the most unusual, the rarest, was one called the Southern mammoth, and we'll talk a little bit more about that.
Okay. And were some of these mammoth bones found in the La Brea Tar Pits?
Absolutely. The remains of about 43 in the La Brea Tar Pits that were excavated and prepared. And of course, there's a very nice specimen at La Brea when you walk in. It's can't unnotice it, so to speak.
Wow. Yeah. So what is a tar pit anyway?
Well, a tar pit actually is kind of a misnomer. What we refer to in the profession is a tar seep. That whole area of Rancho La Brea and the greater part of that area was an oil field. Mm-hmm. And it was very active for a number of years. And the tar, which is actually asphalt, seeped to the surface, which was pretty unusual. Under a lot of pressure, seeped to the surface and got all kinds of things stuck.
Okay.
Thousands, in fact, and millions, in fact, of different kinds of animals were found their way to another world at that point.
When you visit the museum there, you see that there's a little, it's like a pond outside, and
Yes.
so you have water on top and tar underneath, I guess.
Well, at one time that was excavated. It's called the lake pit, and that's where a majority of the tar was excavated, and it was shipped all over the place to cities who were looking to pave streets. So it was a street paving, and the excavators never covered it up. So over a lot of years, probably 100 years, it filled with rainwater, and there's still specimens. So when you see it and you see these bubbles seeping to the top, that's methane. So there's something still going on organically, and it's escaping. So,
Wow.
yeah.
So hundreds or thousands of animals got trapped in the...
Indeed.
Maybe going for water or
They might
just
have,
crossing it?
yeah, they may have gone for food and water, and oftentimes the seeps that were at the surface were covered by leaves and things like that, and so unwittingly these animals wandered into it, and it takes only about 2 inches of this stuff to trap an animal, a large animal, and once they get stuck, they're gonna move around trying to escape, and oftentimes they're gonna topple over, and that's their death knell, basically. And then other kinds of animals come in and attempt to eat the specimen that's been trapped, and of course they get trapped.
Caught.
So yeah, it's a never-ending cycle.
Right.
Yeah.
So how deep down into the ground did all of this sink?
Well, the animals actually were stuck on the surface, and then over time, the sediments covered them up.
They got buried.
They got buried. Yeah.
I imagine they would just sink down into the ooze, but
not really. No, the ooze kind of stayed where it was, and sediments covered the the dead animal.
Yeah.
And today it's called Pit 91, is still actively being excavated, and that's about 15 feet maybe down right now. And every summer that is excavated, and specimens are still being recovered. Yeah.
Yeah. You mentioned one that you have written about.
Yes. Yeah, this one was the most unusual of all the species, although when I say unusual, what I mean by that is that we've found very few of them in the United States. One in particular in Southern California, which was discovered in 2005. And the circumstances about which it was found, there was a excavation going on. Actually, it was a preparation for a housing development in Moore Park, California. And in Moore Park, the grading was going on, and in such large projects, a professional monitor, either in paleontology, which is basically fossil expertise, or an archaeologist, which is artifacts, are required to be on site. It's a California law.
Really?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
So whenever you have a large-scale project, those people are on site. So what happened was these big graders were going along preparing the site for a housing development called Meridian Hills, and all of a sudden the grader, and these guys know after all these years when to stop, and he stopped dead because he hit something, and it was a tusk. And so he called the monitor over. The monitor came over. His name was Trevor Lindsay, and brushed away a little bit and exposed more of the tusk. And he said, "Oh, I can't deal with this by myself." So he called another team in, who was at that time my best friend, who assembled a team to come up, and they excavated about 75% of the animal. Which was a pretty miraculous excavation, because it took very, very little time. You don't want to hold up a commercial project or an industrial project too long. So
did they take the animal away so that the project could continue?
Yes, indeed.
Yeah.
Yeah. They jacketed. In other words, they put plaster on the bigger parts, and out it went into a laboratory. The city, however, took possession of the mammoth because it was on their, it was on the city limit, within the city limits, and immediately the assistant city manager became a mammoth expert. He was quite a guy, and
at least in his own opinion.
Yeah, and he learned a lot real fast. He was very good about that and became a good friend of ours. Anyway, along with these days, along when you are recovering a fossil, you oftentimes take the sediment that surrounds the animal because it helps place time and other factors in the environment during that time. So the paleontologist who was in charge of this excavation figured that this doesn't seem to be in the strata, rock strata of a Columbian mammoth, which is the most common one that is found in Southern California. And he offered the specimen to La Brea, and they said, "Oh, it's just another Columbian. Nah, we're not interested." Well, anyway, it turned out that this specimen, based on the sediments that were analyzed over time, it turned out that those sediments yielded a little tiny tooth from a little mammal called a meadow mouse. Or microtine. It's the genus name is Microtus. It was 800,000 years old. It turns out that most of the Columbians are 40 to 10.
Oh, I see.
So it was way, way earlier, and it came across the land bridge, as most of the mammoths did, along the Bering Strait, and migrated down to Southern California. As of this time, we have maybe 5 specimens of the southern mammoth. That's the one that the book is all about. So when my friend, the chief excavator, said, "I think there's something for you, to do," I developed an exhibit for the city. I also wrote a short book, and it turned out that they never published the book. So when my publisher came along, he said, "What do you have?" And I said, well, I told him a few titles that I was working on. And I said, well, I also submitted a script for a mammoth book. He said, "Oh, a mammoth book." I said, "I don't own the rights to it." And he said, "Do you suppose we could get them?" And so we visited the city. And he said, "Well, we're never really going to publish it." So they gave us the rights to go ahead and publish. And it turned out that it was this book, called Big M. Yeah, I named her Big M, the Mammoth of Moore Park, and it turns out that she was one of those 5 southern mammoths that have been found in the U.S. And actually, her origin was in Italy. And
really?
She migrated from Italy all the way to Siberia, across the land bridge, which was frozen in the Bering Sea, and down to California. So she had quite a trek by the time she met her.
How did you establish that she had come from Italy?
Well, that's
she had an Italian accent.
Something like that. Maybe she ate a lot of spaghetti, but it got so fat. But anyway, she migrated down here, and so the story about her that's in the book is based on the scientific evidence that came out of that excavation. So we weren't trying to just fictionalize a story. It turns out that it's fiction, but it's based on the real facts that came out with the bones themselves. So we hypothesized that she was all by herself. She was about 50 to 55 years old. She was on her last set of teeth, and I'll talk about that in a moment, before she would have starved to death. But she didn't die of starvation. What we believe happened was that she was in a rainstorm, and she wandered into a shallow basically a shallow pond and got stuck.
Ah.
And being the largest thing on the landscape, you know, when you've got thunder and lightning, lightning is likely to strike the largest, the tallest thing on the landscape. And so based on her skull, which was split, we believe that she was probably struck by lightning, and that's what did her in. She had struggled to try to get out of this pond, and finally she got hit by lightning, and she fell over, and then of course got buried over many, many thousands of years, and then excavated in 2005.
I used to teach at Biola University, and I know that when they were excavating for a new dormitory, they ran into a mammoth there, and so they, last I knew anyway, that was roped off, and you could see a little of it. But,
yes. Yeah, there are mammoths all over the country, but this particular species is one of the rarest of all. It is the rarest of all. So, when I mentioned the six set of teeth,
yes.
It turns out that this is a Colombian mammoth tooth. This is the most common, and this is the grinding surface of the tooth. Well, it turns out that it was a grazer. And grasses are full of silicon, and it's very, very hard on the enamel and the other surfaces of the tooth. And it turns out that mammoths generally have 6 sets of teeth, two on the top, 2 on the bottom, but 6 sets of them. And when this grinding surface wears down, there's another set of teeth that come in. They kind of migrate in from the rear of the mouth.
Sort of like children with baby teeth and adult teeth.
In some ways, yeah, but these were all mature by the time they entered the mouth and then wore down. At the end of the 6th set, if the animal hadn't died already, this was useless in grinding grass, which was what this animal ate, and it starved to death.
It's hard to imagine that an animal the size of a mammoth could survive on grass.
It is.
There's not a lot of calories in grass, I would think.
No, about 700 pounds a day.
Wow.
That's what they would have to have consumed to stay alive day after day. In contrast, I have a mastodon tooth, and you can see that it's a much, much different kind of tooth. For example, it's smaller because mastodons were smaller, and this animal was a browser. This animal did not eat grass. It ate branches off trees and brush and shrubs. So
it has kind of a bigger texture to it.
Much bigger surface, grinding surface. Yes, indeed. Yeah.
Wow.
But you can see that there's nothing small about a mammoth. There just isn't. Their appetite, their size.
How tall would they have been, shouldered?
Well,
okay, we have a big thing here in front of us. What are we looking at, Kurt?
Well, we're looking at a footprint of a mammoth. As I said, there's really nothing small about these, and these are the toes here. The footprint itself is about as big around as a car tire. For convenience purposes, I've got this little hula hoop, which we can put around here to approximate the circumference, the distance around this footprint. And it only works for elephants and no other animal, no other 4-legged animal, no other 2-legged animal. But if you take the circumference, the distance around, and multiply it times 2, it turns out to be the height at the shoulder of a 4-legged animal.
Is that right?
Yeah. So it only works for elephants, including the mammoth. So if we measured this around, it turns out that this hula hoop is 6.5 feet around.
Wow.
So this animal at the shoulders, which is how we measure 4-legged animals, 4-legged mammals, I should say, this animal would have been 13 feet at the shoulder.
Okay.
And then the head was another distance up.
So this is actually looks like a plaster cast.
It is. It is a fiberglass cast of this. Yes, this was found. They made a mold of it, and then they made a cast of it or a replica of it. So this is an actual replica of this.
That's made from that that same.
Yes.
Wow. Amazing animals.
Yeah, they certainly were. Well, I want to show you one other thing that will convince you that there's nothing small about mammoths. This is a human femur.
Okay.
This is
a pretty good sized one too.
Yeah, this is our from the hip to here's the hip ball to the knee. This is the biggest bone that we have.
This would be a bigger man than I am.
Yeah, probably me too. But if we compare the human to a mammoth, now we're talking big.
Wow.
So this is a mammoth femur.
Is this the real bone?
This is a cast of the bone. It's a replica, but it was taken from the real thing.
I see.
Yeah. So we've got the ball joint and we've got the knee.
Wow.
So we're talking big.
That is big.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm going to remove this for a moment.
Okay.
And I'll bring a couple of other things up that were, so to speak, in the neighborhood of these animals. We've got, of course, the all-famous saber-toothed cat.
Oh, yeah.
Most people call these saber-toothed tigers, but that's, again, a misnomer because they were actually cats. They had a short tail. These 9-inch teeth were saber-like, and when this animal opened its mouth, it had to open it about 120 degrees.
Wow.
Which is really a large bite. And this was a ambush predator. It didn't climb trees. It didn't run after animals. It's laid in wait.
Oh, I see.
And when an animal like a horse or a baby mammoth, for example, or a camel or some other prey species came by, it would simply lurch
jump,
out.
spring on it.
Spring out and so another animal that was in the neighborhood of mammoths at the time were giant ground sloths. These were animals that normally stood on 2 legs. They could walk on 4 in kind of on the sides of their feet.
And all of these things existed at the same time.
Pretty much. This was mammoth time. This was 10 to 40,000 years. This was 10 to 40,000 years, or 40 to 10, I should say. And then we also had this guy here, and La Brea has tons of these. And this is a wolf, and there were large packs of wolves in the.
Oh.
Yeah, there we go.
Looks like an unfriendly guy.
Yeah, perfect. And there were large packs of these roaming all over Southern California. They were called dire wolves. This is a timber wolf, but the dire wolf was a little bit more robust than a timber wolf would be today, the ones that we have today, and major predators, of course.
Yeah. Now, all of these animals have disappeared. Of course, the relatives are still on Earth.
Indeed.
But we have wolves, we have sloths, we don't have mammoths, but we have elephants.
Yes, we do.
Yeah. But so what caused the demise of these animals? Had to do with climate, I expect.
It did indeed. Yeah. At the end of the last ice age, which was around 10,000 years ago, it became warm. And it was cool earlier, and then it became warm. And
define warm. Would that be about like it is now, or warmer?
Approximately, yes. Yeah, approximately like it is now. It was cooler and more moist during the last ice age, during the Pleistocene epoch, as we call it. But the climate warmed, and it changed the flora and the fauna, and these animals lost a lot of the food that they had, and of course the predators didn't have the prey that they needed. So all of the large animals became extinct. Now the smaller ones did survive. There were numbers of smaller animals that survived pretty much in their current form that survived the end of the last ice age. But most of the larger predators and the larger prey went.
There were a number of ice ages, were there not?
Yes, there were. Yes.
Yeah, and so there was a kind of a periodic change in the climate.
Absolutely.
Warm to cold to warm.
Absolutely.
Et cetera. What caused that?
Well, I think it was just a matter of the way that Earth evolved. Earth changed, and it had cycles. We see, autumn, spring, winter, and summer.
Right.
That was a small scale change. Of course, the climate change. We estimate climate being determined by the average of 30 years of weather, so to speak. And so we had, well, I think I can't exactly recall how many different ice ages and then changes, but there's definitely a cycle.
We're undergoing a period of climate change right now, at least if we're to believe what we hear in the press.
Oh, absolutely.
And what do you attribute that to?
Well, that is attributed to industrialization. Back in the Industrial Revolution and a couple hundred years ago, we began to develop sources of energy that were not known or used before. And these were primarily coal, oil, and gas.
Fossil fuels.
Fossil fuels that produced what we now call greenhouse gases. If you ever have wandered into a greenhouse, you know it's warm even though it might be cooler outside because the sun enters the glass and the warmth doesn't escape. Well, the same thing happens when you have greenhouse gases such as carbon dioxide and methane. They trap the heat instead of letting it go into the higher atmosphere, and that causes what we're experiencing today is a climate change. But this is the first and only human-caused climate change. Others have been natural. This is a human-caused one.
And what's the solution? I guess we hear this all the time, but to reduce the gases.
Yes, reduced greenhouse gases is really the only solution, and there are lots and lots of ways that can be done. Probably the most effective way is to place a fee on the original oil, the original gas, and the original coal that will eventually inspire, if we call it that, inspire the producers to yield to less greenhouse gas emissions and more efficient energy like sun, solar, wind, and geothermal.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, you're now retired, I presume?
I don't want to be. I'm pretty active. I'm on the second edition of my Mammoth book. It's due to go to the publisher early next year, and it'll be about twice the length that it is now. It's about 60 pages now. It'll go to probably around 100 pages, and I'm looking forward to getting the second edition out.
What else do you do?
Well, I do a lot of volunteer work, particularly with my neighbors. I do all kinds of little workshops that we hold in the neighborhood, and
right here in Laguna Woods.
Right here in Laguna Woods.
Really?
Yeah, yeah.
How would we find out about something like that?
Maybe being on your show again would be a good idea.
Okay.
But I'm due to do one on Ice Age animals, and then take a field trip to tar pits.
A fascinating place, and you're a fascinating person.
Well, thank you.
So thank you for coming in and sharing with us. And
Tom, it's been my pleasure to be on the show.
thank you.